Hi, I'm Roxanne Chess and I'm a pediatric occupational therapist. Today we're going to talk a little bit about handwriter helper. So with handwriting, you've probably heard that occupational therapists can support with that. If you have, maybe your child's teacher had recommended occupational therapy assessment for handwriting. So I just wanted to give a little bit of information about this because it's really common. It comes up a lot. So with your handwriter helper, there's just 4 things that I wanted to talk about first today. So first of all, why is your child being referred for help with handwriting? What's the source of the problem? With anything in therapy, we need to find out what is the source of the issue, and then that's what we're going to address to fix that issue. Not just practice, practice, practice without figuring out what's causing the root of that issue. So visual perceptual skills is what your brain interprets from what your eyes see. So vision is what your eyes are taking in that visual input, but what your brain makes sense of that information is visual perception. So sometimes there's an issue with visual perception that can impact a child's ability to learn shapes and also the symbols for letters. Additionally, there might be issues with visual motor skills. So that's eye-hand skills, really. And so when a child is first learning, it's not just the fine motor skills, which you've probably heard about and you see on developmental milestone charts, those fine motor skills in the hands, but also how am I able to use my vision and my hands together to be able to learn to draw shapes, learn to draw letters. Also tracing is another skill that visual motor piece comes in, and that's often the beginning of how children are taught handwriting in schools. And so if that's impacted, you'll see issues come up there with precision. Also, of course, the fine motor, as mentioned, the way that we grasp and hold onto crayons, chalk, markers, and eventually pencils can impact our ability to write precisely and to write carefully. You can also have fatigue, so the child might just fatigue more quickly due to some lack of endurance in their hand muscles, and so that can be another area that comes into play. Lastly, I do want to mention fine motor coordination or bimanual coordination using 2 hands together. So ideally, one hand will be stabilizing the paper, the non-dominant hand, and the other hand will be engaged in the coloring or writing task. And so other activities that would involve bimanual coordination would be cutting, learning to fold paper. So if you're not seeing your child use 2 hands together, that might be part of what's going on as well. Now, something that's often overlooked, and this is, I think that teachers do an amazing job, and I have a lot of respect for teachers out there, but something I've noticed when there's children who are having issues in learning how to form letters, oftentimes I see that the prerequisite pre-writing shapes are not down pat. So that's going to be as simple as your vertical lines down and across, moving into bisecting lines like a cross, diagonal lines, curves, and of course shapes like a square versus a rectangle. It's really interesting sometimes to see that that long versus short line is not always delineated clearly. And so then when you go to write a letter E, that long line versus the short lines across might not be clear to this child. Also, the diagonals that come into play. Diagonal would be the last of the developmental sequence that we learn for our pre-writing shapes. And so diagonal shapes such as a diamond or even just as simply as a diagonal line, these need to be addressed and taught. So oftentimes there's additional cues that we'll give, and we'll get into that in another video, but additional cues that we can give in therapy to help teach the child those shapes. What you can do first and foremost is to teach those lines. Help your child learn the vocabulary around a line down, a line across, a diagonal versus a curvy line. You can even use color coding to help them identify those differences. On top of that, you want to teach the form for the letter. So it's super, super common that we'll give children a book with tracing, all different letters and shapes, and there's tracing dots. But do we tell the child where to start? Do we tell the child the formation of that letter? So oftentimes we don't do that, and then the child can learn sort of bad habits, such as starting at the bottom, and that can translate into messier writing later. So it's really helpful to learn how to form the letters correctly. I would direct people to Handwriting Without Tears. You can Google image that and find, some basic images that give you arrows and a 1, 2, 3 to tell you the sequence of how we would write letters. But yeah, it's just really helpful to instruct your child on starting your letters at the top and the formation of each letter so they're not left to figure that out for for themselves. So thank you so much and happy handwriting.